Thank you all, Tria and Tamara, for your wonderful welcoming remarks. Now I am going to turn it over to our colleague, Philip Strabrowski, who is the moderator for the first panel on New York City planning and environmental justice. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Tari, for that introduction. Thank you, George and Director Case and Associate Vice Chancellor Schneider for your opening remarks. And of course, thank you to all in attendance today. I'd like to welcome everybody to the first of 3 panels today. The title of this panel is New York City Planning, the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure and Environmental Justice. And to discuss these issues, we're very excited and honored today to have a group of panelists who have been doing extremely important organizing work around environmental and social justice in minority and working class communities across Queens. I will be moderating this panel. And in the interest of time, I will just be introducing the panelists by name and organization. For fuller bios of each of the panelists, as well as links to their group's websites, please see the link that will be posted in the Q&A panel on Zoom. I would also ask that the audience please hold your questions until the Q&A session, which will follow all of the panelists' presentations. At that time, you'll be able to post and to enter your questions into the Q&A panel. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelists, Kristen Hackett and Stan Morris. I'm not sure if Stan is on just yet, but I know Kristen is here. Kristen Hackett and Stan Morris from the Justice for All Coalition.
Thanks, and thanks for pulling together this panel and this day. I think it's really great to be here and having this conversation with CUNY faculty. So I have a little PowerPoint presentation that I'll share, if that's gonna be okay. And I thought I could just give kind of an overview of the work Justice for All Coalition does and a little history, I guess. And also, towards the end, we did brainstorm some ideas of what we thought could be the seeds of some collaborations going forward. So I'll share those at the end. So maybe folks don't know us. So Justice for All Coalition, we're just a group of neighbors who live or work or play in Western Queens, mostly Long Island City and Astoria, but other folks are also in Sunnyside. Fighting for just development, fair housing, and good jobs. And the roots, space, and leadership of the organization are in the local public housing developments. And actually, that's from where the group emerged in 2016. Some members of the Community Church of Astoria, which is a church attended by public housing residents predominantly, were concerned about the intensified development that they were seeing around the developments, like the luxury high-rise hotels, Hunters Point South, affordable housing that was coming in next door to public housing, while conditions in public housing continued to deteriorate around tenants. And the tipping point for the group really was the LIC core rezoning study, which came about in 2016 in preparation for another rezoning in Southern Long Island City, which at that point had been recognized as the cause of a lot of the overdevelopment that was starting to happen, and was perceived to be a threat of more development, but not for public housing residents. So the group started by educating themselves and building communities. So they visited folks out in East New York and even up in the Bronx to learn about the rezoning fights that were happening there and what other community members' concerns were. And they held public meetings with local tenant associations in the local developments, as well as independent meetings with public housing residents to start to grow the group a little bit. And in the spring of 2017, they launched as an official coalition, the Justice for All Coalition, with a formal steering committee and leadership structure. Over time, the group has changed and grown a little bit and expanded in terms of the perspectives of their concerns. So the steering committee today is called a melting pot by our chairperson. It includes and has attracted people living in public and private market housing. Everybody kind of has in common, like sort of the geography of Western Queens. And people have had different issues related to housing, small businesses, their artist studio, et cetera, all sort of stemming from the overdevelopment that's happening and the sort of undemocratic ways in which the city proceeds with those development decisions. We have some bylaws and leadership structures which privilege traditionally marginalized voices in group discussions and decision-making procedures to hold on to the roots of the organization. And our collective perspective continues to be centered around the concerns and needs of public housing residents and is grounded in a racial and class justice analysis. And eventually the LIC core rezoning study was shut down. The city took that off the table, but the group continued to work together because there were a slew of other threats that came just on the tails of that. So here's some of them. So there was, at this point, the notorious Amazon fight. There potentially still is a potential rezoning for Northwest Ravenswood, where they're talking about turning it into kind of a tech hub. It sounds a lot like they're trying to expand what happened in Williamsburg into that area, which is just across the street from Ravenswood and just next to Queensbridge. There's Sunnyside Yards, the BQX trolley, which is supposed to run all the way down into Brooklyn. And then back at the Amazon site, there was another development proposal. And then there's another third one that just was proposed a few months ago, actually, after killing Amazon and the Your LIC development. And then there's a lot happening on Hallett's Cove, which is also where Astoria Houses is located. And our main concern here is like, where's the public money for public housing, right? There's a lot of public money actually that's funneling into Western Queens through these different initiatives. For example, in Hallett's Cove, our council member, Costa, actually allocated $11 million for playgrounds and ball field upgrades and things like that. That's the exact same amount of money that Astoria Houses needed to fix the boilers so that they would have reliable heating systems, so this is like budget priorities. And also that investment, that $11 million buffers the private development that's happening there, right? Justifying higher rent prices and potentially spurring gentrification. And things like that can be found throughout all of these deals, right? The 3 to 4 billion tax abatements that were in the Amazon deal. And then there's also sort of always this promise of jobs, but these jobs are not good jobs and they tend to reinforce the structural inequalities rather than upending them. And then within this, there's also sort of climate change concerns, right? And those we brought to the forefront during Sandy and are very vivid in people's memories. So the top image actually on the left-hand corner here is Long Island City during Hurricane Sandy, and it looks a lot like Houston during the Hurricane Harvey that they had down there. And so some of our organizing efforts against some of these development deals has been to show how, like, where they're situated vis-a-vis where we might expect floodwaters during big storms in the future. And our argument was like how this kind of development might actually amplify or intensify flooding, even beyond what we saw during Sandy. In addition to like making these arguments in relation to private development, we're also doing a bunch of organizing within public housing alone. So as you probably know, right, these buildings are deteriorating pretty rapidly at this point. The estimated physical needs assessment is about $40 billion. And what that looks like in tenants' everyday lives is like persisting mold and mildew, pests, like rodents and roaches, bathrooms that are kind of crumbling every time you turn the water on, stoves and appliances that don't work and aren't being replaced, etc. And so starting in January of last year, we started submitting formal letters of complaint, which go to the local public housing management office, but also we CC other NYCHA executives as well as elected officials. And these letters basically document the repair needs and concerns that residents are having in their apartments as well as in their buildings. And you can see a map of some of the letters. This isn't quite up to date. I think we're up to 150 at this point. And it's growing beyond Queensbridge and Ravenswood. We still have some in Astoria houses, Woodside houses, but increasingly across the city as people reach out to us. And we have seen that this has helped get some people's repair needs met, but ultimately the public funding is what's really needed. We are working with Queens Legal Services in this endeavor. So the formal letters of complaint are actually the first step towards pursuing lawsuits against each of the local public housing management offices. We're also supporting tenants in withholding rents, particularly when they have gas or other utility outages, and in seeking rent abatements. And of course, we're trying to amplify the issues through having like rallies, press conferences, getting the media involved, and elected officials help with that as well in some cases. And then also last summer, maybe some of folks heard about the uptick in violence, particularly in public housing developments here in Western Queens, maybe across the city. It was a concern that was brought to us by residents living in those buildings at one of our tenant meetings. Her son had actually had a very close encounter with gun violence out on the block. And so it prompted us to really look more closely at what policing looks like in Western Queens, and specifically in Precinct 114, which includes the local public housing developments here. We just put out a report earlier this week. I can't remember what time is anymore, but it basically summarizes a lot of the research on policing and policing in public housing, and then takes a very close look at how policing plays out here in Western Queens. And what we find is that it's very racialized and classed in nature, like following suit with the patterns that we've seen across the city. But here, because Western Queens is such a racially segregated place, we see that it's actually amplified for public housing residents specifically. And then with public housing, these concerns are also amplified by banishment policies like the permanent exclusion policy, where police interaction actually puts their right to housing and their right to their future in direct jeopardy, because they can be expulsed from housing permanently for any interactions with police. And then again, there's the issue of public funding. So NYCHA tenants pay twice for policing, and they're over-policed, and there's a lot of public money flowing through policing. And in Western Queens, we can see that that public money is specifically intended to police public housing residents and not invest in their well-being, right, or in the quality of their homes or anything like that. So this is another sort of point of contention that we've been raising and will continue to organize around. And we're also doing a lot of citywide coalition building in the fight for, at the legislative level, in the fight for funding, for public funding. So we're looking at the Public Housing Emergency Act, which Elizabeth Warren actually just introduced to the Senate yesterday, which is amazing. And that would recoup $70 billion, which then would potentially, or in theory, bring a lot of the buildings up to code. It's a little bit outdated at this point because the bill was introduced a couple of years ago when the need was around 30 billion. So now the need is even greater, and the bill has not been updated. But it's a first step towards getting some repair needs met. And what we're trying to do is get that money now. And then we're also working in coalition with folks to push the Green New Deal for public housing, which would retrofit the buildings, but also strengthens the Section 3 requirement, which requires NYCHA and HUD to hire public housing residents in the maintenance and upgrading of the buildings and invest in those lives. So we're also, NYCHA has been a terrible actor, I think, by some assessments. We could call NYCHA a terrorist organization in the way that it treats tenants. And so we're fighting for also resident management over public housing. And at the city and state level, we're also fighting against carceral policies, defund the NYPD, the 4 new jails we don't need. And we're fighting for funding at the state level, again, to kind of get in line these, stable funding over time, right? Thinking about a 7 generations sustainability perspective for public housing is what our interest is. So in terms of like how working with CUNY could support this work. Some of the things that tenants or that our steering committee came up with, definitely research and technical experience, of course. You know, there's a lot of development happening here in Western Queens, and getting some help in terms of tracking some of these rezonings and what the different aspects of the rezonings and plans are would be helpful. Highlighting some of the sustainability issues with projects like the BQX and Annabelle Basin. So doing some independent technical assessments with climate change in mind. Mold and mildew testing is a major issue in public housing right now, and there is a special office that's supposed to do testing and then justify remediation of the buildings. That independent office is like not taking requests anymore. It's very difficult for tenants to get that. And so we've been trying to find ways to do the mold and mildew assessments ourselves, but we don't have capacity. So help with that would be amazing. I was also thinking about social surveys, like in the W.E.B. Du Bois kind of style. I'll also say that on that front, there is so much research done on public housing that I'm not sure we need one more study to show how bad the conditions are, but I still think doing a social survey that broadens the perspective of what concerns public housing residents have might be worthwhile, right? Because it's not just about repair needs, it's also about the lack of control over housing. There's also assessments of, with the Green New Deal for public housing specifically in mind, residents, our steering committee was interested in maybe in having CUNY folks think very concretely about what the physical needs assessment would be with respect to that. So even if once we pass the Green New Deal, we'll have to look at like on a building by building basis, what's actually needed. Somebody was like, how many trees do we need, right? What does remediation look like? And so helping community members figure out exactly what the Green New Deal for public housing could look like in these buildings would be really great. There's also some interest in a community-based planning approach, you know, that really does center community needs right now. And right now that feels even more prescient as Corey Johnson's comprehensive planning is being pushed, which threatens, I think, to take community members completely out of the planning process. And so having a counter to that, that's really rooted with communities having like first and last say. And I think even more generally, working with community members to re-envision the planning process. You know, I keep saying, why doesn't this look like participatory budgeting, right? You know, or at least starting with that as a model and thinking through what other processes we could do. And then there was also an interest in more analyses or technical support in understanding kind of who we're actually up against, you know, in terms of who the developers are, but also the financialization practices that are operating through development in New York City and governance in New York City is something that's, you know, organizers are seeking, but it's a lot of research. And then there's also interest in public education. And some folks from Queens College actually have been working with folks at the Western Queens CLT, which includes some of our members, to hold like public meetings, give technical assistance on what community land trusts are and how to set them up and what the funding can look like. And I could see those like more facilitation and public education meetings being led by academics or CUNY folks. And I will say we have worked with an academic in the past, somebody from the Pratt Center who was like assigned by our funder to work with us. And we ended up having some issues. Basically, she was proposing solutions like TIF that would generate public money for public housing, but would also put other working class residents in the area in harm's way, basically. And so we ended up kind of like distancing ourselves, I guess, from that. And so from academics who maybe want to support this work, we're looking for comrades who are interested, you know, in the larger fight for anti-racist futures. This is, you know, not just solutions that work in the short term. Yeah, and so I think I'll leave it there, I guess. I hope that was good, not too much.
Thank you, Kristen. No, that was perfect. That was just right on time and particularly helpful, I think, the last slide in discussing how CUNY could help the initiatives you're working on. So thank you very much. Our next speaker for this panel is Abigail Aviles Tecaxco. She is with Queens Neighborhoods United.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So again, Abigail Aviles, Tecaisco, very close, Philip. It's so nice seeing faces. I feel like sometimes through Zoom, everyone has their camera off, and it just feels so impersonal. So I'm happy to see so many faces today. And like Philip said, I'm an organizer with Queens Neighborhoods United. We organize against criminalization and displacement in the communities of Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, and Corona. So today we're here to talk about a little bit, right, about ULURP, about how green spaces incorporate into that, as well as anti-racist work, right, and anti-oppression work. So I guess I want to talk a little bit about the campaigns that QNU has participated in or has led. So if folks are familiar with our communities, right, so it's very diverse, it's working class, primarily immigrant, right? We have a large undocumented immigrant community as well. So you can see, right, how all these different overlaps have created so many levels of oppression, right? But one of the things that we do, right? So if folks don't know, QNU is actually we're not a nonprofit, we're not a 501c3, we're completely grassroots. We're all neighbors from the communities who have taken power within our own hands, right? Because historically our communities have been disenfranchised and have been taking power from them, right? So QNU is a great way for us to take our power back and organizing our communities against what we believe is unjust and what we believe is wrong, right? So in our community, right, near 82nd and Roosevelt, if folks are familiar with that area, there used to be this very popular movie theater, right? It used to show Bollywood movies with like English and Spanish subtitles, right? It was extremely unique. It was beautiful. It's just a sentiment, right? Or a symbol in a way of how diverse and beautiful the community is and how we come together in these different ways, right? There used to be a fruit market, there used to be a hair salon, a nail salon, right? But then in September 2016, Sun Equity Partners and Husco Group purchased this plot of land and bulldozed everything that used to be there, right? And then you fast forward to February 2018. The developers go public with their plans for this plot of land, right? They wanted to have 2 stories of storefronts. And then above that, in total, it would be 13 stories of luxury apartments. And in order to do this, they would have to go through the ULURP process. And I'm assuming everyone here is a little, knows a little bit about the ULURP process. I know Sunny does. So right, so that's what we have up against, right? We're up against these 2 developers who purchased this plot of land for $60 million, and they want to turn this plot of land into a 13-story luxury building, right? Luxury apartment building. So of course, immediately we sprung into action. We knew that this would have devastating impacts on our communities, and the displacement, the gentrification that we have already seen, it would just exacerbate that. Right. And we did hear that, right? There was like small businesses in the area who their landlords were telling them, well, Target is coming, so I'm going to double your rent. Right. And that did happen. Right. We did hear these stories from different small business owners because apart from the luxury buildings, there was the 2 storefronts, the 2 stories of storefronts. They had put out the developers had put out this image of who they wanted to come, right? Which businesses they wanted, and the specific ones that they had shown were Target and Chipotle, right, and Starbucks, right? So like the unholy trifecta, right, of gentrification. So again, right from the get, we knew that these developers did not have our small businesses in mind, did not have our street vendors in mind, did not have the safety and the security of low income working class tenants in mind, right? They had a specific image that they wanted to put out. They had specific people that they wanted to come in and to move in, right? So again, right, like identifying this as a problem, as an issue for our communities, we immediately started campaigning and organizing against it, right? So again, this ULURP process was something we were completely unfamiliar to, right? We were learning as we were going, right? So one of the first things we learned was, okay, well, the developers have to go through the community board, right? So what did we do? We brought out 200 residents from the area to come out and to voice their opinion against the development, right? And we were successful, right? Because the community board, it specifically was Queens Community Board 4, because of all the opposition that they have heard because of what we organized. The community board voted unanimously against the development. However, unfortunately, the community board only has an advisory voice. It's not a definitive voice. So unfortunately, that didn't put a stop to the development. So the next step in the user process is going before the Queensborough president, right? And like I said, we're learning this as we go, right? We don't get paid to do this. We're not paid scholars or paid organizers. So we're learning as we go, right? So we find out that the next step is Melinda Katz, right? At the moment, at the time, she was the Queensborough president. And what did we do? We brought out moms from the local PTA, right? So the local school that's closest to the development is PS 89. So we brought out the PTA, the president of the PTA. So you see just a bunch of brown women in that room, right? So again, like these spaces are not designed, right, for working class moms. They're not designed for single moms. But here we are bringing and empowering brown women, brown moms, and to voice their opinion against the development. Melinda Katz, right, if you know her history and her funders and her donors, she ended up voting in favor of the development. And again, that's kind of something that we expected, right? Given her track record, she voted in favor of it. But again, the borough president only has an advisory voice. And then the next step, right, is the city planning commission. Same thing. These, right, I go back to, right, like how our communities have been historically disenfranchised, right? And so you look at who's in the city planning commission, and again, it's not people who look like us. It's not people who have mold in their bathroom, right? It's not people whose stoves don't work like the way the things that our community faces, right? They're not going through those same things. So again, the city planning commission ends up voting yes on the development, and this is the very first vote that actually does matter, right? And the city planning commission did vote yes on the rezoning. And then the next step is city council, right? So the city council member for that plot of land is Francisco Moya. And same thing, right? He has the same track record as Melinda Katz. He has specific donors and specific funders that will not make him accountable to the community, but that will make him accountable to the real estate market, right? And developers. So throughout this whole time, he's a huge fan of the development. He's talking about how it's going to bring good jobs, right? And as Kristen spoke, right, we know that these jobs are not good jobs, right? They're low paying, they're minimum wage jobs. You see the practice of corporations like Target and Old Navy and Banana Republic, right? They have the ability to hire full-time staff, right, and pay everyone, right, like 40 hours a week and give them health benefits and dental benefits, but they choose not to do that, right? They purposely hire only, instead of hiring, for example, 20 full-time staff, they'll hire 40 part-time staff. That way they don't have to give you benefits, right? And like they'd like to paint this picture that it's like part-time, you know, college students, but the reality is that there's full-time parents trying to make a living off of working these part-time hours, right? So again, like these are corporations that are taking advantage of us, right? So Francisco Moya, he's in complete favor of the development, talking about how it's going to bring good jobs, how you know, it's going to bring affordable apartments. So the developer would have actually gotten a tax abatement, right, for creating affordable apartments. But if anyone on the panel can quickly, like, right, like on your own time, you can quickly just go to housingconnect.com and you'll see that the affordable apartments listed there are not actually affordable, right? So you'll see like a one bedroom going for 2,100. In what world is that affordable for our communities? It's not, right? But again, they would have been getting tax abatement for creating these affordable apartments. So throughout this whole time, right, throughout the whole ULURP process, QNU, we're doing community events, we're doing community workshops, and that's right. So again, like CUNY has definitely been an ally. So during this time, I already had graduated from LaGuardia. And I had been a student organizer at LaGuardia, so I had different ties to like whether it be professors or just students who were still there. So throughout this process, I was still engaging with many CUNY students against this. And actually, yeah, within CUNY, I think within CUNY, we have a couple CUNY graduates, just because, again, like if you see the demographics of a college like LaGuardia, right, you see that most of the folks come from immigrant neighborhoods, right, like ours. So we were heavily connected to CUNY, to LaGuardia Community College. And so that's what we kept doing, right? We kept doing community workshops, community events to find out, right? Like, what does the community actually want? And one of the workshops we did was that we posted up poster boards outside of the development and asking the community to pin up or to draw what they wanted, right? And what did we see? We saw so many beautiful answers, right? A kitchen for street vendors to cook in, right? Playgrounds, a mental health clinic, right? And one of the things that we really saw is that people were desperate for green space, right? And if you look up areas of Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, and Corona, we are the communities most deprived of green spaces compared to New York City. And other communities as well, like historically Black neighborhoods are also some of the communities that you can see have the least amount of green space per capita. So instead of, if these developers truly wanted to benefit our community, right, they could have chosen to do something like a green space, right, a community garden, right, because that's something that we actually needed. We didn't need luxury apartments. Right? So that kept coming up, right? Like that we need green space, but unfortunately that was not the case, right? So then after all this organizing and all the town halls that we had and all the pressure that Francisco Moya felt, he finally withdrew his support from the development. And that was like the tipping block, right? So then once Francisco Moya came out that he was no longer supporting the development, thanks to all the pressure we were putting on him, the developers pulled their rezoning application. And it was a huge victory for us, right? Like everyone around us, right, was telling us that this was going to be an uphill battle, how it was almost going to be impossible, right? But we did it. We won, and they withdrew the rezoning application. This was a huge victory for us. This was in July 2018. But so even though the rezoning application was rescinded, we still had to fight against the 2-story of storefronts. And again, right, like we knew who they wanted in there. They wanted huge corporations, right, who also don't pay taxes, right, who don't pay their employees livable wages. And so that's not what we wanted, right? And again, like I said, because of the local landlords knew Target was coming, they started raising the rents for small businesses in the area, right? And this is pre-COVID, right? Before the catastrophe that has left on our communities. But even then, right, it was a rents that people could no longer pay, right? So it was devastating to hear of these news that they still wanted to create or still wanted to welcome these corporations into our neighborhood. But we were organizing against it, right? We took it to the BSA, the Board of Standards and Appeals, and throughout this entire process of fighting against the corporations coming into the neighborhood, Amazon is announced that's coming to LIC, right? And throughout this, right, we worked with different organizations like Justice for All Coalition, right, CAV, and so. Right, so the Amazon battle, it's in 2018, right? So October 2018, they announced that they want to bring Amazon into LIC, and they didn't actually have to go through the ULURP because the governor was an advocate for this. They were allowed to completely bypass the ULURP process. And again, right, it was like another battle that everyone told us it was going to be impossible to win. And throughout these months, right, where we were fighting and organizing and holding workshops, again, where did we go? We went back to CUNY to organize CUNY students against the Amazon HQ2. And again, we had the support of so many CUNY students who were also so motivated and so energetic to fight this battle with us. And again, the same issue of green space came back, right? Because like, how is there funding, or how is the budget made where Amazon can be giving a 3 million tax cut, right? And developers can be given tax cuts, but our communities can't be invested into, right? To have green space, to have free daycare, right? To have free public transit, right? But then again, right, we know the story with Amazon. Soon later, February in 2019, Amazon announced that they would be, again, that they were revoking their plans to come to LIC. And I say this all to say that there's so much power in organizing, and the voices that need to be elevated are the ones who have been historically disenfranchised, who have different levels of oppression, right? So it's so important to create power and empower people who are right, undocumented, who are students, who are working class people, who are moms, right? Like you don't expect moms to be organizing, but there's power in doing this, and we see the results, right? When we do censor these voices, we see the results, right? Like the developers who rescinded the rezoning application, and when Amazon pulled out of LIC. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you very much, Abigail. As speaking as a LaGuardia faculty member, I can say we're very proud of you to call you an alumna of LaGuardia and very inspired by the work you continue to do and that you have done while a student at LaGuardia. So thank you. Our next speakers today are Sine Bayan and Bobby Nathan from the Flushing Anti-Displacement Alliance.
So thank you, Professor Hom and Queens College for sharing this opportunity to present and inviting us to be part of this panel. I am Sine, I'm an organizer, and I would like to share what I learned from the battles that I've been. First of all, I'm part of FADA. FADA, or Flushing Anti-Displacement Alliance, is an alliance of Flushing residents, workers, small business owners, and neighbors who oppose the special Flushing Waterfront District rezoning. And Zender, Jane, and I, as you can see here in the presentation, our names are here. We were able to write this opinion piece about green gentrification and environmental racism collectively. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about those. And I am not a professor, and I thought there are a lot of different people in academics who could share more information about gentrification. So upon the invitation, I start thinking a lot about what I can offer as an organizer. So I want to share the stories and lessons I learned as a person who were fighting at the front line and doing grassroots organizing. Before we move on, I want to mention that environmental racism is obviously a global phenomenon, but I'm only going to zoom in and talk about the case of Flushing rezoning. First of all, I just wanted to start by sharing this quote. In 1982, Benjamin Chavez, an African-American civil rights leader, coined the term environmental racism. And I wanted to highlight the everything, but especially the last part. It's the history of excluding people of color from leadership of ecology movements. The word exclusion is so powerful, and I think we are going to go over this a little more throughout the presentation. Again, I was part of FADA, and I was an organizer at Minkwon Center at the time, organizing Flushing community for housing rights. Communities in FADA and Minkwon fearlessly fought against this Flushing rezoning. And the rezoning was 11 block rezoning, and people are still fighting about this. And the developers are trying to build 1725 luxury condos, a few hundred hotel units. They didn't do environmental impact studies. That was a huge thing. And no community inputs, no meaningful community inputs. Flushing is already overcrowded, and schools are 120%. I think it went up to 130% recently. Not too sure, don't quote me on that, but about 120% overcapacity. So there was a lot of issues with this rezoning, and people, especially us, people were rising up to fight against this rezoning. I didn't make this chart. As you can see, I got this image from the University of Minnesota, and they have Create Initiative. It's called Create Initiative. I picked this image because I wanted to show the process of green gentrification, and this chart nicely highlights that. Everything is a planned process. Nothing is coincidence, it's planned, it's systemic. And I put this blue line, this is not from the original, but I wanted to put this here because how the this really highlights how the gentrification happens, right? As you can see, there is only one part that says community input right here. And a lot of talks are just being made upon like with the government and developers, right? How many look at like, let's just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it goes on, but for the community input, it's just like one right here. And green space is such as park and waterfront walkaway. It's so desirable to people, and therefore increases the value of real estate. So when they put those green spaces in the neighborhood, the property values increase, and therefore people who used to live in those neighborhoods will be displaced. Just to share a little bit more about Flushing, I think a lot of you are familiar with it because Queens College is in Flushing. But many Flushing residents are limited in English proficiency, and low-income people of color. This community has been forced to bear the burden of predatory rezoning project without being allowed to provide any meaningful input. So I wanted to just go back to the quote from Benjamin Chavez, the history of excluding the already vulnerable people who would be impacted by the systemic injustice the most, would be excluded from the leadership and decision making again and again, and it repeats. And our community has already been struggling negative health impacts from the polluted environments, but frequently no event to make community input happens. Even if it happens, it will be so cursory or perfunctory in a way that it would not have the power to influence the decision. I think that, as Flushing residents deserve a clean creek and usable waterfront. However, this already vulnerable community should not accept displacement as the price they must pay for this better environment. I wanted to share this image really quick because during the ULO process, this article was deleted. And we found out that it was so upsetting that it was deleted and it wasn't online, but now it's back up. That's so, I don't know if it was coincidental, but that's what, I will just like pause there, but I wouldn't go further into it, but I just wanted to highlight that people have the right to live in a clean, safe, healthy environment. However, the history of New York City, people of color were designed to live and disproportionately damaged by the hazardous pollutants. Moving on to the next, I wanted to talk about power. So throughout the presentation, I really wanted to highlight the importance of power. Everyone should have power to control your own life, environment, in your neighborhood. But we need to really think about it. Does it really happen? Do we really have power to, live in clean neighborhood, right? Or those decisions are being made by someone else, right? And I wanted to highlight this quote that it's from the opinion piece that we wrote together. I'm just gonna read it for everyone. Like many low-income communities of color, residents of downtown Flushing must live with higher rates of air, water, and noise pollution than their wider, wealthier neighborhood. According to this Union of Concerned Scientists report, Asian American residents are exposed to twice as much pollution as are white residents in New York. Further, this types of pollution is the largest environmental health risk factor in the United States, responsible for 63% of death from environmental causes. Moving on to the next one, and racism. For the sake of time, I will just read this. This rezoning and development are embedded in economic structure and personal choices that promote money-making condo developers without regard for local residents, particularly in communities already suffering environmental injustice. Luxury housing will lead to economic displacement. In an interview with Professor Laura Cushing at UCLA, noted that racism doesn't only operate at a personal, interpersonal level. Our society was set up with laws and zoning practices that maintain segregation. The whole system is not designed to bring about equality. And I wanted to highlight that during the interview with Professor Laura at UCLA, I asked her, oh, developers are claiming that they are from Flushing and they're Asian. Would that make this rezoning any less of environmental racism? And it was really remarkable what she said. In summary, she highlighted that it's not about the person or entity giving harm, it's about the people who are getting harmed, right? So the people who are getting harmed are, people of color, that it becomes racism, right? Lastly, I just wanted to say that environmental racism is systemic racism. We need to counter and challenge every level, from policymaking to the enforcement of regulations and laws. We also need to make sure that people have significant power to the decision-making process and the results. People who would bear the most burden should have the most say in the process of decision-making. The history of excluding people of color from leadership of decision-making should not repeat. To do so, we need to build power from the bottom up. How do we do it? Organizing, bring people together, develop the leadership of these people, build allies and take actions. And you can find more information about us here. And I just wanted to say that this year is really important. There are a lot of elections are going on. So, to connect with your local organizations to make sure you exercise your power. And I'm going to pass it to Bobby.
Hi, good morning. My name is Bobby Nathan. I'm a long-term resident in Flushing. Actually, in 10 days, I'll be living in Flushing for 40 years. So I grew up here. I know the streets here. I know a lot of the people here. I attend St. George's Church, which is like the largest church here in Flushing. It's trilingual, English, Spanish, and Chinese. I also volunteer at the food pantry, which right now we serving 10,000 Flushing residents every week. I also volunteer at Minquan as a volunteer housing organizer. I got my start. It's so funny that Sunny mentioned Benjamin Chavis. She doesn't know this, but I got my start under Ben Chavis, working for the United Church of Christ on Madison Avenue. That's where we started first. So it's funny that she mentioned that he coined the term environmental racism. I've watched Flushing change. When I got here, Flushing was predominantly white and Jewish. I've watched it change to becoming Asian. And I've now watched where the developers are running into Flushing, buying up the rent stabilized buildings and pushing out people. So downtown Flushing is considered from College Boulevard to Sanford Avenue, where I live, to Casino Boulevard, Union, and Northern Boulevard. That's what's downtown Flushing. So I live on Sanford. Right now, the developers are buying up everything that they could find here. On this street where Minquan is, where I am right now, if you go outside, you see land for sale. You see like 6 new buildings on 2 blocks going up. We have hotels everywhere. Right now, we have 21 hotels in downtown Flushing. And they're building actually, I think it's 5 online to be built. And then by the waterfront now, where they just got permission to build, they're gonna build 3 more hotels. These are causing a lot of rats to be running around here. We have huge rats just running the streets here in Flushing. Also, people are being displaced as well because the developers are doing construction in like every building where they buy. These are not like green constructions. These are constructions so they could get MCIs. which is major capital improvement. And so they're putting in new elevators, new roofs. They take the ceiling down in the hallway and make the buildings unlivable so people can't no longer want to stay in the buildings. Then they put up, like, instead of putting up like energy efficiency lights, they put up lights that's gonna get them a lot of MCIs. So like in my building, we had like 9 lights in the hallway. They so-called improve it and put up 40 lights. On the outside of the building, they didn't need to put up lights because there's a lot of street lights where we live. They put up like 20 lights on the outside of the building. Then they put cameras. We have 52 cameras in a 6-story building. And then they also put up what we call the speech monitor. So whenever you speak inside the hallway, the landlord, they can actually hear what you're saying in the buildings. So we have Treetop Development that bought some of the buildings here in Flushing. We have A&E, and we have, I forgot the other name of but they're all here in Flushing just buying and flipping the buildings. Also, we have F&T. So F&T is building like their empire here in Flushing. So they own what's called Flushing Commons. They own a couple of the sites in the new development that's supposed to be taking place in Flushing West. They also own Queens Crossing. So they're like the major developer here in Flushing that's pushing the gentrification. But they mostly build condos and hotels and office buildings. They do not build like rent stabilized apartment. And so they give a lot of money to the politicians here in Flushing. And so even the building that CB7 Community Board 7 is in is owned by F&T. And so they are the ones like pushing to get everything built here in Flushing. So we have construction everywhere. We have hotels, luxury condos, and a lot of them are getting tax break. And people here cannot afford to live here anymore. We're losing like supermarkets. So there was a supermarket beside Flushing Town Hall. They tore that down. That's going to be a new hotel. We had a supermarket by Codgeport Boulevard and Avery, Western Beef. That's now closed. And we also had another supermarket, and that's also closed. So we're losing supermarkets and we're losing gas stations as well. It's crazy what's going on here in Flushing. So I'm not sure if you know about the rezoning by the waterfront, where they're gonna build condos and hotels, 3 new hotels. And they're supposed to be building 61 units of affordable housing. But where they're putting it is site 4. So site 4 is not a part of the site 1, 2, or 3. Site 4 is by itself by the Northern Boulevard and Cottage Point. So those are like the 2 most used roadway here in Flushing. It's also truck routes. So it's a lot of lead pollution down there. Site 4 also has 2 cement factories, and it has 2 asphalt plants. So this is where they want to put the affordable housing. If that's not environmental racism, I don't know what it is. Site 4 is also the lowest point of the land over there, where they're building by the waterfront, and it's prone to flood. And this is where they want to put affordable housing. Also in Site 4, where they say they're going to put the affordable housing, it's going to be a mixed-use building. So they say it's going to have manufacturing in that building as well. So how can Queens College help? Queens College has been immensely helpful to us as organizers here in Flushing. So for example, a former student of yours, his name was Jeremy Mango. He wrote what's called a case construction eviction in the shelter force. If you read it, it actually tells you like what they did here in Flushing. And Professor Hum has written a lot of articles of what happened here in Flushing. But what we really need though is testing. We need to test these buildings that they're doing for asbestos, test these buildings for lead, test these buildings for mold, and test site 4 so we can show the danger of where they want to build the affordable housing. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Sine and Bobby, for that presentation. And finally, for this first panel, we have Jose Miranda from Chaya CDC.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. First, I want to thank Queens College for the opportunity to speak to you all today. So quick introduction. I'm Jose Miranda. I'm the Director of Programs at Chaya CDC. And at Chaya, we're sort of a direct service organization, right? So we work in economic justice, housing justice, immigration, and then we do advocacy and organizing work as well, related to all of these issues. Our mission at Chaya is to build the power, housing stability, and economic well-being of the South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities in New York City. We're primarily focused in Jackson Heights and Richmond Hill, which are ethnic enclaves for, Jackson Heights, traditionally South Asian communities, while in Richmond Hill, there's a large Indo-Caribbean population as well as a Punjabi population. So it's kind of where we've centered our work traditionally. And as I mentioned before, we're mostly a direct service organization, right? So breaking out our mission a little bit, we do focus on sort of building power, and that means a lot of policy advocacy, some community organizing, primarily focused on our housing work. So we, work with tenants to form tenant associations, to, push back against landlords who are preying upon tenants, harassing tenants, doing a lot of, just unscrupulous behavior. And we also engage in civic engagement activities. On the housing stability side, tenant counseling, tenant organizing, again, pre-purchase counseling, foreclosure prevention. Again, a lot of the work that just kind of is sort of direct support to people for economic well-being, financial counseling, free tax prep, just a lot of programs. I kind of highlight all of this to say that Chaya traditionally doesn't engage in a lot of the work that we've been talking about, so far. It's a lot of sort of one-on-one individualized help, and the way that we try to build power is through either organizing activities directly related to our areas of expertise, or broader kind of civic engagement work. However, we do want to be a voice for the community. So over the last couple of years, we've sort of gotten into a lot more work around economic development, particularly focused on trying to, push the city towards more community-based economic development, because we do see ourselves as a voice for our communities, both the South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities, but also sort of low-income Queens residents as a whole. And so I want to kind of highlight 3 ways that Chaya has been involved at kind of different levels, just to kind of highlight how organizations who don't typically engage in a lot of direct organizing and actions can still become involved and sort of activate their community. A lot of this, all of this we've talked about before. My fellow panelists have covered a lot of this. I just kind of want to talk about how Chaya has gotten involved and how Chaya, sees itself as sort of pushing economic development forward in a more community-based way. So, starting with Amazon, everyone knows about, got a little bit of a timeline here, but, there were just a ton of issues with Amazon from the beginning, whether it's the $3 billion in tax breaks for Amazon, or skipping the Euler process, or not getting enough community engagement, real estate speculation that leads to displacement of a lot of folks, and gentrification. This was just kind of a major thing from the beginning. And I think that Amazon in particular is what really activated Chaya into a lot of this economic development work, and we weren't alone in that. There were a lot of organizations, a lot of community members who saw this as an affront to their needs, seeing, the richest company in the world getting all of these cutouts while, we have issues with housing, with pests, with childcare, with, low employment, with, jobs that don't pay enough. Meanwhile, the city and the state are finding billions and billions of dollars to line Jeff Bezos's pocket. So the way that Chaya got involved in this is, Chaya is seen as a sort of leader in the South Asian and Indo-Caribbean communities. Been an organization that's been around for over 20 years at this point. Have done a lot of work to build housing stability to help people achieve their dreams of home ownership, stay in their homes, build power to fight back against landlords, to have some economic mobility. And so Chaya really worked to try to bring as many groups together to form coalitions to help play an active role in opposition to Amazon. So that includes working with other organizations such as, other nonprofit groups that we can work with. So other South Asian based organizations like DRUM, partnering with more grassroots groups like QNU, and just like individual community members. We serve thousands and thousands of clients every single year. And so talking to them about their community needs, how they might be impacted by Amazon bringing their headquarters to New York, how they would prefer the city and the state spend all of their money, and really, using this as an example for education and activation into opposition to make our community needs and bring those to the fore. Queen's Target that Abigail spoke about, right? So I won't have to get into a bunch of details there, but still, there was, this is a case where Chaya just didn't have a lot of bandwidth to get as actively involved as we did with Amazon, where with Amazon, we were planning actions and bringing groups together and doing a lot of that work. Instead, we took this as an opportunity to just focus on what we call economic democracy. So we had some economic democracy days in Diversity Plaza, which you see here, where we sort of talked to folks about, how is money being allocated for things? What do you want to see in your community? And think about why community needs aren't always being met by, the current economic development process. In addition to that, Chaya, did some advocacy directly with council members and things like that, but we weren't able to activate in the same ways that we were with Amazon. We sort of, focused more on education here. And then currently the Flushing waterfront rezoning is something that we're actively working with today. We are part of, where am I? So we're part of a lawsuit in this case. We're members of the Fed Up Coalition, so Flushing for Equitable Development and Urban Planning. And basically it brought a lawsuit against the city saying that, back in 2015, there was a project in Flushing that was considering rezoning, and a study there found that there would be significant impacts to the environment, and they ordered that an economic impact statement be done. Right, and this is like a lengthy sort of labor-intensive process, but with this round of rezoning, there was just an environmental assessment statement instead, which is much lower, doesn't get as deep. And so that was the grounds for our lawsuit that we're doing with partner organizations through the Fed Up Coalition. And so in these cases, this was another case where COVID is happening. There's a lot of things going on. Chaya isn't able to engage in a lot of the organizing work that is necessary to really push back, but we found other means to sort of slow down the process, give community members time to weigh in and voice their opposition. What I really wanted to focus my time on today is just looking ahead, right? So, again, as I mentioned, Amazon kind of activated Chaya a little bit to think more about this and activated a lot of community members. And I think it's a good sort of learning opportunity to think about, well, you know, traditionally in New York City, economic development has been planned and implemented by the powerful people in New York City, right? So real estate interests, lawmakers, and largely, you know, as was mentioned earlier, community input isn't a big part of that. So what could community-based economic development look like? And so, you know, at Chaya, we've done a lot of work to try to be thoughtful about how we can approach community-based economic development by taking a couple of different paths. So one is, you know, we are an organization that is an expert, or at least, you know, have done a lot of work and are well known for our work around affordable housing, right? Both affordable home ownership as well as, you know, affordable rental units for folks. So in our base, we've noticed that there are a lot of folks who are living in basement apartments. And basement apartments in New York City are illegal for, you know, for various zoning reasons and other things. And so we built a coalition and are pushing forward with a campaign to make basement apartments both safe and legal in New York City, right? Because these specifically address community needs. Landlords or homeowners are looking for ways to be able to better afford their mortgage. And so bringing in a tenant into a basement apartment will allow them to afford their mortgage and stay in their homes. In New York City, you know, affordable apartments are at a premium. There's just limited stock everywhere, right? As we talked about with Flushing, there's 1,700 new units going up. Only 61 of those are affordable. And it's kind of debatable with a lot of affordable apartments, how affordable they actually are for community members. So basement apartments also afford an opportunity to have more affordable housing units throughout the city. And this is a complicated process, but it's something that people are passionate about. There are thousands and thousands of people in New York City right now living in illegal basement apartments, and they might live in unsafe conditions, but are afraid to call 311 because the second that the Department of Building finds out that there's a basement apartment there, it's not that it's going to be remediated and rectified and the landlord is going to get a fine. It's that they're going to be kicked out of their apartment. So how do we both make it safe and make it legal? So, you know, it's a complicated process. There's rezoning that has to happen. There are some basement apartments will need to be retrofitted. So we're working with a coalition of organizations who are, engaging with the city council to both pass laws to make this safe, to do rezoning, but also to provide funding for construction. We're doing a pilot right now in East New York with about a dozen or so homeowners where we will relocate current basement apartment tenants, provide zero interest loans to the homeowners, to retrofit and bring their basement apartments up to code, and then move the tenants back into now a legal, safe, and affordable basement apartment in New York. And, you know, with the city's current fiscal crisis, there have been some delays there, but we're hoping, you know, we hoped to launch last year. We're hoping to start to relocate the first of those tenants in the summer of 2021. Another project that Chaya is really engaged in is working with other community groups as part of a coalition to bring community land trusts to New York City. So this is like a purely democratic, community-owned way of developing the city back up. So, Chaya is part of a coalition of organizations who received funding to educate communities about what community land trusts are, how community land trusts can impact communities, whether that be for more affordable housing, whether that be for affordable commercial spaces for small businesses or incubation. We're working with Western Queens CLT group as well to take a look at sites in Long Island City where, your LIC right now, and formerly the Amazon building, that sort of area. How can we bring a CLT to Western Queens? So we want to be more thoughtful about not just being reactive to sites that come up or economic development projects. We're going to continue to do that, but it's also important to plan with community members to envision what we want our communities to be and look for pathways into creating that. And so that's really important with us, or for us rather. And as we look ahead in partnership with CUNY, ways that we can try to make that work are to look for academic expertise, right? What's the research on sort of where there's availability for land for CLTs? What would the impact of that be? Help us more formalize what some of the community needs might be moving forward. But also, as was mentioned earlier, right, organizing students, pushing out to more community members. The more people we have involved in this, the more normal it seems to be. And then it pushes back against the powers that be, like EDC, like politicians who are leading economic development today. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Jose. So that wraps up the initial panel presentations. I'd like to welcome Stan Morse, also from the Justice for All Coalition, who is joining us for the discussion. Good to see you, Stan. We have just about 10 minutes for questions and or discussion. And I'd invite the audience, the attendees, to either type in a question in the Q&A, or if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, I can unmute you and you'll be able to ask a question. So are there any questions to begin with? I have one, but if others want to start. Okay, maybe I'll go ahead then. So a number of you had mentioned the struggle against Amazon HQ2 and your various groups' involvement in that struggle, which we at LaGuardia were also involved with. That was certainly a bright spot, I think, in many ways, the victory against HQ2. But of course, that hasn't stopped Amazon from expanding in New York City in other ways, not just in office space, but in terms of delivery stations, right? And in fact, even in Western Queens, we see that, right? There's already the Woodside delivery station. There's a new plot, the old supermarket on 21st Street, right across the street from Queensbridge, which is going to be a delivery station. And so I guess one of my questions is about organizing, perhaps, or thinking along the lines of environmental justice when it comes to this sort of new phenomenon. It's not new, but it certainly is growing and expanding of sort of e-commerce in the city, and which communities are being sort of burdened with the environmental and sort of nuisance effects of that. And if there's any thought around that from the groups.
I can think of, we've been thinking a little bit about that with Justice for All Coalition, and it really picks up where Jose kind of left off, really thinking about what does community-based economic development look like. And as corporate actors continue to try to like ravage the city, we also are looking at sort of like how to build like local ecologies and economies in structures like community land trusts that like sort of create buffers or divisions between like residents living here and sort of global financial capital, which including corporate investment. So that's kind of like how we're thinking about moving forward, and definitely to Jose's point, I mean, like support from CUNY with thinking through those things going forward would be very helpful, I think.
Are there other questions, perhaps from the audience?
Yeah, thanks. I was really pleased to see how much use of CUNY and CUNY students many of these organizations have made. But I was wondering if maybe the Justice for All coalition could perhaps get in contact or make a little more use out of CUNY's administration, particularly TRIA, and of course with the new Associate Vice Chancellor, who is really closely related to your field in the social sciences. And you may be able to perhaps talk with yourselves or among these coalition of coalitions, find ways in which even at the administrative level, you could get some additional stuff out of CUNY.
I might just respond to that to say, like, it would be helpful to have some support in making those connections. You know, and I also just say I'm a CUNY student myself, actually, at the Graduate Center, but I still like wouldn't even really know how to reach out to Tria or what kind of questions to ask her, what kind of support she could provide. So I think some facilitation in making those connections would be really helpful.
I personally am not in a position to provide you with support, but I could perhaps make some suggestions if you thought about particularly the idea of how you would be getting students to work on particular projects that you're interested in. And I heard that from some of the other groups, but I didn't hear you mention that. And I will just state that I had a class, which is one of our capstone courses. I had students design PVC systems based on these tools that Tria talked about for a cluster of 51 buildings in Flushing. Spoke with the owners of the thing. And now I understand that they're trying to find ways in which they can get that done. It's a cash cow for the owners. If they can have and join this this solar electrification process, the owners have a lot to gain from it. And so do the building occupants, because it would upgrade the quality and the stability of their electrical. So anyway, that's just one idea that I've worked on, and you might take a look at some of the things that Tria's office, particularly, you can just see that online, what they do, and think about ways. And if there are a way I could help, that'd be great. But I'm sure that our urban studies program could also do that. I'm in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. I'm an ecologist and kind of a hard scientist. But our urban studies program, I'm sure, could be very, very helpful. And that's true, I think, at all the other colleges as well. So it's not just Queens College, but the whole of the CUNY system, and trying to make use of our students. And it's also sort of giving a note to the faculties that, there are lots of ways in which our students can be engaged if we can identify specific processes that are of value to the community.
We have one question here from the audience, which I think we could answer perhaps briefly in the time that we have left. And it's the following: what are your thoughts, and this is for the entire panel, on EPA and NYDEC community input protocols? Are they effective? Is the data they present to the community understandable?
I mean, I can speak a little to the sort of community perspective of like, is the data understandable, or is the information understandable, right? When EDC had these like presentations of what Sunnyside Yards would look like, hosted throughout Queens, and in attending some of those, it's understandable, but kind of in a way that really spins nothing but the positive, right? It's not an objective understanding of what a project would look like. It's really based on selling it to community members rather than presenting an honest assessment of the pros and cons of this, right? What are the impacts to the community beyond just, well, we're going to bring housing and we're going to bring jobs, right? Like all of these talking points that you'll get from a PR company. But what does that mean for affordable housing? What does that mean for congestion? What are the other investments outside of the scope of this project that the city is going to have to make in order to make this happen, in infrastructure and transportation, in other facets of city life, and what does that mean to community members? I don't think that is presented to community members in a like frank and candid way, unfortunately.
And just to quickly add to that, because I know we're running short on time. I think Jose and I were at the same Sunnyside Yards meeting at Aviation High School, and when community showed up to oppose Sunnyside Yards, right, we were completely shut down, right? Like they had cops ready. So that completely speaks to how community members, how working class people are excluded, right? Because when cops are called, that could mean that's the difference between life or death for a person of color, right? So again, that just speaks to how these spaces are not made for us, how the information is not disseminated in an equitable way. And it's really just shoved down our throat, right? It's like, it's either you accept or you accept it, right? And if you try to stop us, we're gonna put your life in danger, right? So we saw that with Amazon, we saw that with Sunnyside Yard, we saw that with Target. And I know we're out of time, so that's the only thing I wanted to add.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Jose, also for those responses. I remember that meeting as well. Well, at this time now, I know there might be more questions. Perhaps they can be asked again at a later panel if appropriate. But I am going to bring this panel to a close. We're going to have a short break until 12:10 when we have our keynote address from Council Member Costa Constantinidis. And that will be at 12:10. So I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks again to our wonderful panelists for this first session. It was really informative, and I hope we can continue this dialogue, and I know we will going forward. Thanks, everybody.